Most people think South Park mocks everything equally, never landing a real punch, just cartoon kids cursing at world leaders for laughs. A government thousands of miles away disagreed enough to erase the show from an entire country's internet. What actually pushed them that far is the whole story here. In this video, we break down South Park vs. Communism, South Park's libertarian DNA, and why this topic cuts against the show's usual target. South Park started in a college film class. Trey Parker and Matt Stone met at the University of Colorado, and what pulled them together was a shared love of Monty Python. That connection would end up shaping almost everything about the show they eventually built, including the loose, anything-goes attitude toward politics that still defines it decades later. Before there was a show, there were two short films. Parker and Stone made a pair of Christmas cartoons called Jesus vs. Frosty and Jesus vs. Santa, using paper cutout figures animated in stop motion, a style borrowed from the kind of cutout animation Terry Gilliam had done for Monty Python's Flying Circus. Those two shorts were rough, cheap, and strange, but they caught attention. Between those early shorts and the show that eventually came out of them, Parker made an entire feature-length film while still a student, and the real story behind it says as much about his personality as anything he later put on television. The idea grew out of Parker's own fascination with Alfred Packer, a real 19th century Colorado prospector who became one of only 4 people in American history ever convicted of cannibalism, after he survived being lost in the mountains by eating 5 of his traveling companions. Parker and a small group of friends, including Matt Stone, first put together a 3-minute fake trailer for a film about Packer as an end-of-year project for a film class. The timing behind the project was not purely academic. Parker had recently been left at the altar after discovering that his fiancée, a woman named Leanne, had been cheating on him only weeks before their planned wedding, and in a small act of creative revenge, he named Packer's disloyal horse in the film Leanne after her, a detail that later carried over directly into South Park itself, since Cartman's own mother shares that same name. The trailer drew enough attention that Parker and Stone managed to raise around $125,000 to shoot a full-length version, filming on weekends and during spring break in 1993 across real locations throughout Colorado, including the actual courthouse where Packer had originally stood trial. Parker broke his hip early in the shoot after being thrown from one of the horses playing Leanne. The finished film premiered in Boulder on Halloween night in 1993 under the title Alfred Packer, the Musical, and Parker graduated from the University of Colorado that same year. It went largely unseen outside Colorado until 1996, when the distributor Troma Entertainment picked it up and renamed it Cannibal the Musical, a title it kept once South Park's success turned it into one of Troma's best-selling releases and gave it a lasting cult following on home video. After Cannibal the Musical, Parker and Stone moved to Los Angeles and kept making short, crude animated pieces on the side, eventually producing a redone Christmas short that caught the attention of the Fox network. Fox took a meeting with Parker and Stone about turning the idea into a full television series. The deal fell apart almost immediately because Fox wanted them to cut a character named Mr. Hanky, a piece of talking Christmas poop who Parker and Stone refused to give up. They walked away from Fox and took the idea to Comedy Central instead, which ordered a first run of 6 episodes. Even the first episode showed how unpolished this whole operation was in the beginning. The pilot, called Cartman Gets an Anal Probe, ran 28 minutes long because neither Parker nor Stone had made a television show before and did not realize there was a standard length they needed to hit. That level of inexperience seems almost impossible to imagine now, given how long the show has managed to survive. South Park premiered in August of 1997, only weeks after Parker had also released his second feature film, Orgasmo, showing just how much creative output the two men were already generating before the show had even proven itself. South Park is still airing new episodes decades later, making it one of the longest-running scripted shows in the history of American television. It has stayed on the air through the presidencies of Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, Barack Obama, Donald Trump, and Joe Biden, tackling each era of American politics along the way. Heading into a 27th season, Stone and Parker talked to Vanity Fair about just how strange it is to have covered 4 or 5 different presidential election cycles through the same cartoon. Surviving that many news cycles without becoming permanently attached to one side of the political map is not an accident. It comes from a specific choice both creators have made from the very beginning, one they have repeated in interview after interview. They call themselves equal opportunity offenders, meaning the goal has never been to defend one political team while attacking the other. The goal has always been to go after whatever seems the most ridiculous on a given week, regardless of who it embarrasses. Trey Parker explained this idea using his own cat as an example back in 2010. People sometimes ask him whether the show secretly broadly supports one political party over another, and his answer was that asking that question is a little like walking up to his cat and demanding to know whether the cat is a Republican or a Democrat. The cat is just a cat. It does not belong to a political team, and according to Parker, neither does the show. That same instinct showed up years earlier, while Parker and Stone were promoting Team America World Police, a puppet film they made outside of South Park that satirized the war on terror. Parker described the two of them in that period as pretty middle ground guys, adding that they found just as much worth criticizing on the political left as they did on the political right. Whether or not every viewer agreed with that self-description, it lines up with a pattern that shows up again and again across the show's history, where politicians, activists, and public figures from every direction end up as targets in roughly equal measure. That refusal to be claimed by either side did not stop people from trying to claim the show anyway, and one of the clearest examples came from the political right in the early 2000s. In 2003, the writer and blogger Andrew Sullivan coined the term South Park Republicans to describe a specific kind of young conservative, one who wanted a tough, assertive foreign policy, felt deeply skeptical of political correctness, and had little patience for the anti-war celebrities of the moment, while still being personally comfortable with things like recreational drug use and other choices traditional conservatives tended to frown on. Sullivan pointed to South Park directly as the pop culture symbol of this new attitude, arguing that younger audiences were laughing at sanctimonious celebrity activists in a way that older, more buttoned-up conservatism never had. 2 years later, in 2005, a writer named Brian C. Anderson, an editor at the magazine City Journal, expanded Sullivan's idea into a full-length book called South Park Conservatives: The Revolt Against Liberal Media Bias, using the show's reputation as a jumping-off point for a broader argument about conservative media gaining ground against what he saw as a liberal-leaning press and entertainment industry. Even people who reviewed Anderson's book sympathetically at the time pointed out a real problem sitting underneath the whole idea. South Park's creators had never actually signed on to any of this. Reviewers noted that if Parker and Stone could be labeled as anything at all, it was libertarian, and libertarian ideals are genuinely different from the traditional Republican positions Anderson's book was defending, including opposition to abortion and to gay marriage, neither of which fit anything South Park had ever put on screen. Even Anderson himself, when pressed in later interviews, described the whole South Park-inspired attitude as more of an irreverent cultural sensibility than any kind of coherent, fully developed political philosophy, which is close to exactly what Parker and Stone had been saying about their own show from the very beginning. Despite that constant refusal to pick a team, the specific word libertarian has followed the show for years regardless, showing up again and again in academic writing, magazine profiles, and cultural criticism. A detailed breakdown of the subject matter covered across the show's run describes Parker and Stone as having built a mix of socially liberal and fiscally conservative viewpoints into both their real lives and their writing, which lines up closely with what the word libertarian generally means. In simple terms, a libertarian political outlook tends to support personal freedom in how people choose to live their lives, while staying deeply skeptical of government power growing bigger or reaching further into everyday decisions. That mix plays out constantly across the show in ways that go beyond any single episode. South Park has spent years making fun of government bans, restrictions, and regulations, treating most attempts by the state to control personal choices as overreach worth mocking. At the same time, the show has spent just as much energy defending personal freedom in areas that would usually be labeled progressive, including gay rights, drug use, and sexual freedom, treating these as matters of individual choice that government and busybody neighbors alike should stay out of. The 7th season episode Butt Out captures this combination directly, comparing government bans on smoking to something as extreme as fascism, and arguing that personal responsibility should be the answer to unhealthy habits rather than government restrictions stepping in to make the choice for people. The show has been just as willing to turn that same skepticism toward the political left whenever it saw an opening. A 2004 episode called Douche and Turd mocked animal rights activists pressuring the school over its mascot, and used the resulting mess to build an entire parody of a presidential election, framing the choice voters actually get in real elections as being between two equally unappealing options, rather than a meaningful contest between genuinely different ideas. 2 years later, in 2006, the show aired Smug Alert, an episode mocking the self-satisfied culture surrounding hybrid car owners and environmentally conscious residents of San Francisco, released the same year as the original Man Bear Pig episode, which portrayed former Vice President Al Gore's warnings about climate change as an exaggerated attention-seeking act rather than than a serious concern. That specific target later became one of the clearest examples of the show correcting itself over time, since South Park brought Man-Bear-Pig back roughly a decade later in an episode that treated Gore's original warnings as having been right all along, openly reversing its earlier position once the underlying issue no longer looked like a punchline. Even the technical side of how the show gets made feeds into this pattern of constant, rapid-fire targeting. South Park is built using computer animation made mostly from flat, two-dimensional pieces, a production method that lets new episodes come together in a matter of days rather than the months that traditional animation usually requires. That speed has allowed the writers to react to real-world news almost as quickly as it happens, commenting on events like the international custody battle over a young boy named Elian Gonzalez, the closely contested 2000 presidential election, the capture of Saddam Hussein, and the elections of both Barack Obama and Donald Trump, often within days of the actual headlines. A show that can turn news into satire that fast ends up covering far more raw political material over the years than a typical scripted comedy ever could, which only adds more evidence to sort through when trying to pin down where its sympathies actually sit. The people surrounding the show complicate any simple political label even further. Norman Lear, the television writer and producer famous for creating groundbreaking progressive sitcoms decades earlier, left his own mark on South Park behind the scenes. Lear worked as a writing consultant on some episodes, voiced the character of Benjamin Franklin in an episode connected to the Iraq War, and even officiated Trey Parker's wedding. Lear was an outspoken progressive his entire career, and his direct involvement with a show so often accused of leaning libertarian or conservative is a reminder that the creative circle around South Park has never been ideologically uniform, even if the show's public reputation suggests otherwise. The show's approach to international politics, not just domestic American politics, adds another layer worth noting before getting into the specific topic of communism. The first episode to air after the September 11th attacks, titled Osama bin Laden Has Farty Pants, ended with a wave of low-key patriotic feeling, but it also made room for a young Afghan character to point out that hatred toward America was not limited to the Taliban, and that roughly a third of the world held negative views of the country, regardless of what American children were being told in school or on television. That kind of moment shows a willingness to complicate a simple, comfortable national narrative, even during a moment when audiences might have expected pure flag waving. It suggests that when South Park turns its attention beyond American borders, it tends to resist picking an easy side just as much as it resists doing so at home. This same pattern has continued directly into the show's most recent seasons, rather than fading with age. A recent season premiere took direct aim at Donald Trump, mocking his ego, his treatment of the press, and his sense of his own manhood, continuing a long-running joke in which Satan is shown dating a string of real-world strongmen, having previously been paired with a version of Saddam Hussein in earlier seasons, before more recently being shown exhausted by a relationship with a Trump-inspired character who reminds him uncomfortably of that same earlier boyfriend. That premiere drew close to 6 million views and performed strongly among viewers between the ages of 18 and 49, proof that skewering whoever currently holds power, regardless of party, still draws a large audience even after more than a quarter century on the air. All of this history matters because a topic like communism sits in a noticeably different category from most of what South Park usually goes after. The overwhelming majority of the show's political material stays close to home, aimed at American senators, American presidents, American celebrities, and specific controversies playing out inside the United States. Even when foreign countries or foreign leaders show up, they usually appear as one piece of a larger joke rather than the entire point of an episode. Communism is different because it is not a single politician, a single scandal, or a single news cycle. It is an entire economic and political system, one that has been the official governing structure of several real countries, some of which remain in power today with the ability to respond to criticism in ways an American talk show host or senator simply cannot. Going after a system like that means aiming at governments that can ban a show entirely, censor it across an entire country, or issue formal statements in response. Consequences that carry far more real-world weight than an angry tweet from an offended celebrity. There is also a deeper reason this particular subject fits so naturally into the show's underlying worldview, even though Parker and Stone have never specifically labeled their own politics using the word communism. Communism, at its core, represents one of the most centralized forms of government control that has ever existed, with the state directing large parts of the economy and daily life. A creative team that has spent decades expressing suspicion toward concentrated government power in general was always going to have something to say, whether directly or through background jokes about a system built entirely around that kind of control. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That instinct shows up earliest in a Season 2 episode built around a small-town coffee shop and a handful of tiny underground creatures with an oddly familiar three-step plan for making money. A fourth-grade assignment about those creatures goes badly wrong before it goes famously right. What the boys end up arguing at the end of that episode became one of the show's most quoted defenses of big business. Section 2. Gnomes. Season 2, Episode 17, aired December 16th, 1998. The Foundational Parable. Mr. Garrison's job was hanging by a thread in the winter of 1998, and that small classroom problem is what opens one of South Park's earliest and most quoted arguments about business. The episode, called Gnomes, was written by series co-creators Trey Parker and Matt Stone, along with Pam Brady, and directed by Parker. It was the 17th episode of the show's second season, and the 30th episode overall, and it marked the first appearance of a nervous, jittery boy named Tweak, along with his parents, who would go on to become recurring characters for years afterward. The school board had warned Mr. Garrison that he would lose his teaching job if he could not prove he was actually covering current events in his classroom. To save himself, he assigned his students group presentations on modern topics. Stan, Kyle, Cartman, and Kenny ended up paired with Tweak, a kid who spent most of his time twitching and talking about something stealing his underwear at night. Tweak suggested the group build their whole presentation around these thieves, which he called underpants gnomes, tiny creatures who supposedly crept into his room at 3:30 every morning and made off with his clothes. Tweak's parents ran a small coffee house in town, and that shop was under threat from a much bigger company. A national coffee chain called Harbucks, a clear parody of the real-world Starbucks, wanted to open a location right next to Tweak Brothers Coffee House. A representative from Harbucks, named Mr. Postum after a real brand of instant coffee substitute, offered to buy out Mr. Tweak's shop. First with a fancy briefcase called a Cramsonite, itself a parody of the luggage brand Samsonite, and then with an offer of $500,000. Mr. Tweak turned down both offers. Furious at being refused, the Harbucks representative told him the company would simply build next door anyway, whether Tweak liked it or not. That specific kind of pressure was not something the writers invented purely for comedy. The real Starbucks was in the middle of an aggressive nationwide and international expansion at the exact moment this episode aired, and the company had already developed a reputation among critics for tactics that went well beyond simply opening new stores. Reporting on the company's growth during this period described methods such as buying out the leases of competing coffee shops, intentionally opening locations that operated at a financial loss just long enough to drain business away from a nearby independent shop, and clustering several stores close together in the same neighborhood to saturate the local market entirely. Real accounts from former Starbucks real estate staff described the company's site selection process as ruthless by design, actively watching for small business owners who were behind on rent or otherwise vulnerable, then moving in on those specific locations. Only a year before this episode aired, in late 1999, protesters demonstrating against a World Trade Organization meeting held in Starbucks' home city of Seattle vandalized several of the company's own stores, spray painting graffiti across roughly 24 downtown locations, and seriously damaging 3 of them badly enough to force temporary closures. Starbucks was targeted that day alongside McDonald's and Nike, treated by the protesters as one more symbol of unchecked global corporate power. In much the same breath, critics of that era used to describe Walmart. Gnomes was clearly drawing on a real, live piece of public sentiment rather than inventing corporate villainy out of nowhere. That night, the boys went to Tweak's house to work on their assignment, and Tweak's parents kept the group fueled with an endless supply of coffee. All that caffeine sent the boys bouncing off the walls of Tweak's bedroom instead of writing anything useful, and by the time they finally crashed from exhaustion, none of them except Tweak were awake to notice the gnomes creeping in at exactly 3:30 to steal several pairs of his underwear. With the deadline looming and the group having nothing prepared, Tweak's father stepped in and wrote a presentation for the boys himself, framed around the threat that a big corporation like Harbucks posed to a small business like his own. The boys read this borrowed report to the South Park Town Committee the next day, word for word, without mentioning that they hadn't written a single line of it. The committee was so moved by the presentation that they pushed Mayor McDaniels to act, and she agreed to let the whole town vote on something called Proposition 10, a measure that would decide whether Harbucks would be allowed to open in South Park at all. What followed turned 4 elementary school kids into unexpected local celebrities. The boys ended up appearing on talk shows and in advertisements, held up as the young, innocent faces of the fight against big business. Mr. Tweak loved the attention his family was suddenly getting. His wife did not share that enthusiasm, and she made clear she found something deeply uncomfortable about using children this way to push a political cause they barely understood. Mr. Garrison, for his part, quietly suspected that the boys hadn't written their own presentation. But with his job still on the line, he told them they had no choice but to keep the act going all the way to the actual vote. That put the boys in a difficult spot, because the town committee expected a second presentation before Proposition 10 went to a vote, and none of them knew the first thing about how corporations actually worked. They had been coasting on a report written by an adult with an obvious personal stake in the outcome, and now they were expected to defend it in front of the whole town with nothing to say. Cornered and out of ideas, the boys finally caught up with the underpants gnomes themselves back at Tweek's house. When Cartman confronted one of the gnomes and demanded to know why they kept stealing underwear, the gnome answered plainly that stealing underpants was big business, and offered to explain everything in exchange for a look through the boys' own underwear drawers. That deal led the boys down into the gnome's underground lair, an enormous space packed with mountains of stolen underwear, where the creatures walked them through their entire business plan. The plan had 3 phases. Phase 1 was collecting underpants. Phase 3 was profit. Nobody, including the gnomes running the operation, could explain what Phase 2 was supposed to be. Each gnome assumed some other gnome further up the chain understood the missing middle step, but in reality, the whole business rested on a plan that made no actual economic sense from start to finish. It was, in its own strange way, a business built entirely on faith that things would somehow work out between stealing the product and cashing the check. Armed with this bizarre first-hand lesson in how a business, even a nonsensical one, is supposed to work, the boys walked into the final town vote and completely reversed the argument they had been pushing for days. Instead of warning the town about corporate greed, they told the crowd that big corporations actually do a great deal of good, pointing out that without large companies, there would be no cars and no computers. They added that Harbucks itself had started out as nothing more than a small coffee shop, and had only grown into a massive chain because people liked its product enough to keep buying it. In the middle of that reversal, the boys openly admitted they hadn't written their first presentation either, and that the whole anti-corporate speech had come from Tweek's father the entire time. The reaction in the room was not the outrage anyone might have expected. Mrs. Tweek stepped forward and applauded the boys for finally telling the truth, and admitted publicly that she felt the exact same way her husband's campaign had made her uncomfortable from the start. She reminded the crowd that everyone in town had spent days complaining about Harbucks and organizing against it without a single person actually walking through the door to taste the coffee they were so certain was a threat. That challenge changed the mood of the entire town almost instantly. People finally tried Harbucks coffee, and they agreed, almost unanimously, that it tasted better than what Tweek Brothers had been serving all along. Even Mr. Tweek himself admitted the new coffee was the better product once he actually tried it. Rather than losing everything, Mr. Tweek was offered a job running the very Harbucks location that had threatened to put him out of business, and he accepted the offer on the spot. That specific outcome, a small shop owner ending up better off once a feared national chain actually opened nearby, is not just a convenient cartoon ending. It mirrors a pattern that real coffee shop owners have described in business journalism covering the industry for decades. Multiple independent coffeehouse owners in cities across the country have told strikingly similar stories about panicking when they first learned a Starbucks was opening near their shop. In some cases, even being told directly by Starbucks representatives that the company intended to surround their stores if they refused to sell, only to discover afterward that their own sales actually increased once the larger chain moved in. The explanation those owners gave was almost always the same. A nearby Starbucks draws a large volume of new coffee drinkers into the area, and once the lines of the bigger chain grow too long, a share of those customers wander next door and discover the independent shop for the first time. Industry data gathered years after Gnomes aired backed up the same basic pattern on a larger scale, with independent and small chain coffee houses collectively holding a larger share of the American coffee market than Starbucks itself well into the 2000s, undercutting the simple assumption that a big chain moving into a small town automatically means the end of every local competitor. Running underneath the entire plot, almost as background noise, the Underpants Gnomes never stopped doing what they had been doing since the beginning. While the whole town argued about corporate greed and voted on propositions, the gnomes kept slipping into houses at 3:30 in the morning and quietly stealing underwear from townspeople who had no idea it was even happening. Their strange, half-broken business model simply kept running in the background, untouched by anything the humans around them decided at the ballot box. A few smaller details from the episode round out the picture of what actually plays out on screen. At one point, when Cartman claims that Kenny's family is perfectly happy being poor and living on welfare, Kenny snaps back at him with real anger, making clear that assumption is far from welcome. Kenny also does not make it to the end of the episode, dying after being struck by a falling cart down inside the gnome's underground lair, continuing the running joke from these early seasons where Kenny rarely survives a single episode in one piece. The Harbucks representative, despite being pushy and unlikable throughout, ends up being right about one specific thing according to how the episode plays out, since his company technically has just as much legal right to open a coffee shop in South Park as anyone else does, whether the locals like the competition or not. Even the choice to make the villains of the episode's opening half a group of gnomes carries a real piece of financial history behind it, one that goes back decades before South Park ever existed. Gnomes, as a general symbol, have long been associated with the world of banking and finance, and the specific nickname Gnomes of Zurich has a documented real origin in British politics. During a November 1964 crisis meeting among Labour Party politicians, called to address speculation driving down the value of the British pound, politician George Brown complained that the Gnomes of Zurich were at work again, blaming secretive Swiss bankers for the currency's troubles. Similar language had actually been used even earlier, with Harold Wilson, then serving as Shadow Chancellor before later becoming Prime Minister, reportedly using nearly identical phrasing referring to little gnomes in Zurich and other financial centers as far back as 1956. Once Brown's remark caught on publicly in 1964, the phrase spread quickly through British politics and journalism, eventually inspiring an entire non-fiction book on Swiss banking practices published just 2 years later. The comparison worked precisely because it played on old folklore imagery of small, secretive creatures who live underground and hoard treasure no one else can see, which lined up neatly with how outsiders viewed Switzerland's strict banking secrecy laws at the time. Whether or not South Park's writers had this specific, decades-old political nickname in mind while designing their own underpants-stealing gnomes, the parallel between secretive figures operating underground, hoarding wealth nobody outside their own circle can fully explain, adds an extra layer to a joke that was already built around a business plan nobody, not even the people running it, could actually explain. None of this has anything to do with communism by name. Nobody in Gnomes ever uses the word, and the entire conflict plays out as a local zoning dispute over a coffee shop, rather than any kind of statement about a foreign government or a named political system. What the episode does lay out clearly, though, is the basic economic instinct that will keep resurfacing across every episode covered from here forward. The same suspicion towards centralized control and collective action without a clear plan, dressed up here as a joke about stolen underwear instead of a joke about a 5-year plan. That same stretch of the show, without any connection to gnomes or coffee shops at all, had already found room for a real communist leader from history to show up on screen. He wasn't given a speech, a plotline, or even a name spoken out loud by any of the main characters. He simply appeared in the background of 2 separate episodes, sent straight to one very specific part of the afterlife. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That same stretch of the show, without any connection to gnomes or coffee shops at all, had already found room for a real communist leader from history to show up on screen. He wasn't given a speech, a plotline, or even a name spoken out loud by any of the main characters. He simply appeared in the background of 2 separate episodes, sent straight to one very specific part of the afterlife. Section 3. Mao Zedong's recurring cameos. Mr. Hanky's Christmas Classics, Season 3, and Conjoined Fetus Lady, Season 2. Gnomes never once uses the word communism, and neither does the episode covered in this section, but South Park had already found room for a real-world communist leader from history well before either of those 2 episodes aired. He never gets a scene built around him, he never speaks a line of dialogue. He shows up quietly, almost accidentally, tucked into the corner of 2 very different episodes, both of which have nothing to do with his politics, his country, or his place in history. His presence is small enough that a casual viewer could watch either episode start to finish and never notice him at all. The earlier of the 2 appearances comes in Conjoined Fetus Lady, the 5th episode of Season 2 and the 18th episode of the show overall. It aired on Comedy Central on June 3rd, 1998, written by series co-creators Trey Parker and Matt Stone, along with David R. Goodman, and directed by Parker. This was also the first episode of South Park to receive a TVMA rating, a small but real piece of the show's broadcast history. The episode runs on 2 separate storylines that never really touch each other, which was already becoming a familiar structure for the show at this early stage in its run. The first storyline centers on the school nurse, a woman named Gollum, who Kyle discovers has a small, dead fetus attached to the side of her head, the result of a rare condition the show calls conjoined twin dyslexia. Kyle reacts with disgust and tells his friends, who start making fun of her her behind her back. Word spreads around the school quickly. Kyle's mother, Sheila Broflovsky, overhears the boys mocking the nurse and decides to step in, not by quietly correcting them, but by launching a full public awareness campaign. She organizes something the town calls Conjoined Twin Dyslexia Week, complete with a parade, framed photos, and constant attention aimed directly at a woman who never asked for any of it. When the town finally holds its tribute parade in her honor, Nurse Gollum snaps at the crowd, telling them plainly that she never wanted to be singled out in the first place, and that all she ever wanted was to be treated the same as everyone else, then storms off while the adults in town stand around confused about why she isn't grateful. Running alongside that story is the episode's second plot, which is where the Mao Zedong reference actually appears. The South Park elementary dodgeball team becomes eligible for real competition after Pip, a British exchange student who is constantly bullied and mistaken for being French, discovers that being mocked fills him with a strange, overpowering rage that turns him into an unstoppable player. His anger carries the team through the state championship in Denver. At the national level in Washington, D.C., the opposing team forfeits before the game even starts, purely out of fear of who South Park would have to face next. That next opponent is China, treated by the episode as basically the final boss of children's dodgeball, a team so skilled and so intimidating that even grown adult competitors from the nation's capital would rather quit than face them. The trip to China does not go well for South Park. One by one, the American kids are eliminated, including Kenny, who is killed on the spot after getting hit with a dodgeball thrown so hard it kills him instantly against the gym wall, continuing one of the show's earliest and most consistent running jokes. By the end, Pip is the only South Park player left standing. He wins the entire match single-handedly after his own teammates trick the Chinese players into calling him French one more time, which sends him into the same blind rage that carried him through every previous round. He wipes out the entire Chinese team with a single throw. It is inside this Chinese training gym, during the build-up to that final match, that a poster of Mao Zedong appears in the background. One small piece of set dressing among several other details clearly meant to signal that the room belongs to a communist country's national team, alongside background calligraphy that translates to crude insults rather than anything political. The joke in Conjoined Fetus Lady has nothing to do with any actual government or economic system, and it would be inaccurate to claim otherwise. The episode is making fun of the intensity adults bring to children's sports, and the absurd idea that a schoolyard game like dodgeball could carry the same weight as an Olympic showdown between world powers. China functions here as shorthand for a fearsome, disciplined, almost mythical opponent, the same way a rival could have been swapped out for a wrestling powerhouse like Russia or a track and field giant like Kenya without changing the joke much at all. Mao's poster is simply the fastest possible visual signal a cartoon can use to tell an audience where they are and who they are dealing with, without spending a single second of screen time explaining it. Even so, the choice says something honest about how South Park was already treating Chinese communist iconography by its second season, as a piece of instantly recognizable set dressing, useful, background, and disposable, rather than a subject worth its own storyline. The second appearance of Mao Zedong comes about a year and a half later, in a completely different kind of episode with a completely different tone. Mr. Hanky's Christmas Classics is the 15th episode of Season 3 and the 46th episode of the series overall, airing on December 1st, 1999. Unlike Conjoined Fetus Lady, this episode has almost no plot to speak of. It is built as a variety show hosted by Mr. Hanky, the talking piece of Christmas poo who narrates from a small chair by the fireplace inside his sewer home, introducing one musical number after another. The episode also carries a quieter, sadder piece of real history behind it. It was dedicated to Mary Kay Bergman, the voice actress who performed most of the show's female characters up to that point, who had died by suicide less than a month before the episode aired, making this one of her final recorded performances to reach the air. Among the musical numbers is a song called O Tannenbaum, sung by an animated version of Adolf Hitler, who is shown kneeling in hell beside an empty stand where a Christmas tree should be, mourning the fact that even the afterlife has denied him a tree to decorate. Satan, watching this unfold, decides to cheer Hitler up, and leads nearly every other resident of hell into a large group number meant to lift everyone's spirits for the holiday. That song introduces one by one a long list of hell's other residents taking part in the celebration alongside Hitler and Satan. Among the names who appear during this sequence are the serial killer Jeffrey Dahmer, President John F. Kennedy, his son John F. Kennedy Jr., Diana, Princess of Wales, film critic Gene Siskel, the Mongol conqueror Genghis Khan, actor Michael Landon, actor Jimmy Stewart, and Mao Zedong, referred to on screen using an older English spelling of his name, Mao Tse-tung. tongue. A framed photograph of comedian Andy Dick also hangs above Satan's fireplace during the number, a smaller joke tucked into the background of a scene already crowded with cameos. What makes this particular sequence worth looking at closely is not that Mao appears in hell, since almost every dead public figure the show has ever referenced eventually turns up there sooner or later. What stands out is exactly who he is standing next to. Genghis Khan and Adolf Hitler are both included in this same group, two historical figures directly responsible for organized mass killing on an enormous scale. Mao Zedong belongs in that same category on the basis of real history. He led the Chinese Communist Party to victory in the Chinese Civil War, founded the People's Republic of China in 1949, and ruled the country until his death in 1976. During that time, he launched two massive nationwide campaigns: the Great Leap Forward in the late 1950s and the Cultural Revolution beginning in 1966, both of which historians widely agree caused tens of millions of deaths through a combination of famine, political violence, and social upheaval. Placing him in the same afterlife lineup as Hitler and Genghis Khan is not an arbitrary joke pulled out of nowhere. It reflects a real and well-documented body count from actual 20th century history. At the very same time, that same musical number places Mao directly beside people who did nothing evil at all. Jimmy Stewart was a beloved American film actor. Princess Diana was a young royal figure killed in a car accident, mourned by millions of people around the world. Gene Siskel was a film critic known for good-natured on-screen debates with his broadcasting partner. None of these figures did anything to belong in the same category as a mass murderer, and the show clearly is not suggesting they do. What this reveals, honestly, is that hell on South Park does not function as a specifically curated punishment reserved only for history's worst tyrants. It works as a chaotic, overcrowded holding pen for absolutely everyone who has died, regardless of what kind of life or death they had. Kenny himself passes through hell and heaven constantly across the show's run, and he is a 4th grade boy from Colorado, not a war criminal. Mao's presence in that crowd carries real historical weight underneath it, but the joke itself is not built around singling him out. It is built around cramming as many famous dead people as possible into one increasingly ridiculous holiday number, and letting the mismatched combination of who ends up standing next to whom do the work. Mao's appearances did not stop there. He also turned up in an episode called Do the Handicapped Go to Hell? During a separate scene in which Satan hosts a Hawaiian-themed party in the underworld, adding a third documented sighting of the same historical figure, quietly filling out the background of South Park's version of the afterlife. Taken together across these episodes, a clear pattern emerges. Mao Zedong never receives a single word of dialogue anywhere in South Park's run during this stretch of the show. He never becomes a character with a personality, a joke built specifically around him, or a storyline of his own, the way Satan, Hitler, and even Saddam Hussein eventually would in later seasons and in the show's feature film. He exists purely as a face and a name, recognizable enough to work as a quick visual joke, but never given enough screen time to become anything more than scenery in someone else's story. That silence is itself worth noting, because it marks a clear boundary in how South Park was choosing to use Chinese communist history during these early seasons. The show was perfectly willing to drop a recognizable communist leader into the background of a joke about Christmas or a joke about children's sports, treating him as instantly recognizable shorthand the same way it might use a poster of any other famous face. What the show had not yet done at this point in its run was build an actual episode, an actual plot, or an actual line of spoken dialogue around a real communist government or a real communist leader taking meaningful action on screen. That would take until the show reached its later seasons, once South Park started dealing directly with a country and a communist party that was still very much in power and very much capable of responding. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That shift began several years later when a different Chinese leader appeared in South Park for the first time, not as a silent face in a crowd or a poster taped to a gym wall, but as a character who actually picks up a telephone and speaks. Section 4. Xi Jinping's first appearance. Tweak by Craig. Season 19, Episode 6. Mao Zedong spent years appearing in South Park without ever opening his mouth. He showed up as a face in a crowd, a poster on a gym wall, a name mentioned once inside a busy Christmas song, always present but never given a single word to say. 16 years after his first quiet cameo, a different Chinese communist leader broke that pattern completely. He picked up a telephone, argued with an American parent, brought up real unresolved history from the Second World War, and got angry enough to make a joke land, marking the first time an actual sitting leader of the Chinese Communist Party became a genuine speaking character on South Park rather than background scenery. That moment comes from an episode called Tweek x Craig, the 6th episode of season 19 and the 263rd episode of the series overall. It was written and directed by series co-creator Trey Parker and premiered on Comedy Central on October 28, 2015. The episode arrived in the middle of a season that had been running a single ongoing storyline about political correctness taking over the town, with a character called PC Principal running the school and pushing that agenda into nearly every part of daily life. Tweek x Craig slows that larger storyline down for one episode to focus on something much smaller and stranger, a joke rooted in something that had actually been happening inside the real South Park fan community for years. The episode opens with Wendy Testaberger presenting a slideshow at a school assembly, showing off a collection of drawings made by some of the school's Asian students. Every single picture in the slideshow shows two of the boys, Tweek and Craig, drawn together in a romantic relationship. The style of these drawings is known as yaoi, a real genre of art and comics, usually made by women, that pairs male characters together romantically, regardless of whether those characters were originally written that way. The girls in the audience find the drawings adorable. The boys, especially Tweek and Craig themselves, find the whole situation deeply confusing. PC Principal calls the two boys into his office, and even though both of them insist they are not actually gay, he refuses to listen, instead lecturing them about a concept called affirmative consent, as though their relationship were already an established fact. The real genre the episode is joking about has a much longer and stranger history than most viewers watching casually would ever guess. Yaoi traces back to Japan in the 1970s, growing out of a wave of female manga artists, including creators like Keiko Takemiya and Moto Hagio, who began writing romantic stories between male characters aimed specifically at young women, rather than at gay male readers. That early version of the genre was known in Japan as shonen ai, meaning boys love, and it focused mainly on emotional romance rather than explicit content. The word yaoi itself came slightly later, emerging around the mid-1970s alongside Japan's growing fan-made comic scene, known as doujinshi, and the country's first major fan comic convention held in 1975. The term is actually a self-mocking acronym, standing for a Japanese phrase that translates to no climax, no point, no meaning, originally used by fans themselves to poke fun at how little plot some of these fan-made stories actually had compared to how much romantic or sexual content they packed in. By the 1990s, yaoi had grown from an underground fan hobby into a real commercial industry inside Japan, with dozens of magazines dedicated entirely to the genre, before the more polished term boys love eventually became the preferred label used by publishers both in Japan and internationally. None of this history makes it into the episode directly, but it explains exactly why Xi Jinping's answer to Randy carries a small grain of real accuracy underneath the joke, since yaoi is, in fact, a real and specifically Japanese cultural export, not a Chinese one. This plot was not invented out of nowhere for the episode either way. Real fans of South Park had been pairing Tweek and Craig together in fan art and fan fiction for years, a coupling nicknamed Creek by the online fan community, tracing all the way back to a season 3 episode from 1999 called Tweek vs. Craig. In the days leading up to this new episode's premiere, South Park Studios actually reached out to fans and asked them to submit their own yaoi-style drawings of the two characters, receiving more than 1,500 pieces of fan-made art in response. A number of those real fan submissions were worked directly into the finished episode, alongside a closing thank you to everyone who had sent artwork in. This detail matters because it means the entire premise of the episode, strange as it sounds, was built around something real that had already been happening among the show's actual audience, rather than something the writers made up from scratch. As word of the supposed relationship spreads through town, the reactions from the adults grow increasingly absurd. At the local Whole Foods, Craig's father Thomas gets repeatedly congratulated by strangers who have heard the news, leaving him confused and uncomfortable since he has no idea what anyone is talking about. Tweek's own parents take the opposite approach entirely. At dinner, they tell Tweek they already know he's gay and that they are proud of him, then reward him with money on the spot, treating the entire situation as good news worth celebrating, rather than something worth questioning. Stan, watching all of this play out around him, turns to his father Randy for some kind of explanation, since Randy has spent the season desperately trying to prove how progressive and politically correct he is. Randy has no real understanding of yaoi at all, but rather than admit that, he lands on a confident-sounding but completely wrong explanation, telling Stan that Asian people, as a group, apparently get to decide who is gay and who isn't. Randy treats this invented invented explanation as settled fact, the same way he treats most things he doesn't actually understand throughout the season, simply because sounding certain feels safer to him than admitting he has no idea what he's talking about. Randy eventually decides to get his facts straight by going straight to the source and calls Xi Jinping, the real General Secretary of the Communist Party of China, to ask him directly how his people decide who is gay or straight. The call is shown taking place inside Zhongnanhai, which in real life is a historic government compound in Beijing that has served for decades as the working office of China's top Communist Party leadership, making it the actual real-world seat of power the show is depicting on screen, rather than an invented location. She corrects Randy immediately and plainly, explaining that yaoi comes from Japan, not China, meaning Randy's entire premise for the call was wrong from the very first sentence. Right as she finishes correcting him, Stan walks into the room, and Randy, caught off guard and desperate not to look foolish in front of his son, immediately pretends he already knew the answer all along. That small moment of face saving triggers something bigger on the other end of the phone line. She, apparently annoyed at being brought into this conversation about Japan in the first place, launches into an angry rant against the Japanese, calling them dogs who have never properly apologized to China for war crimes committed during the Second Sino-Japanese War, specifically referencing the events commonly known in English as the Nanking Massacre. That massacre was a real and devastating historical atrocity, and the actual scope of what happened is far larger than the episode has any room to explain. Following the fall of the city of Nanjing, then China's capital, to the Imperial Japanese Army in December of 1937, Japanese soldiers carried out weeks of mass killing, looting, and sexual violence against Chinese civilians and disarmed soldiers. Historians disagree on the exact number of people killed, since the chaos of the event and the destruction of records make an official count impossible. But mainstream estimates generally range somewhere between 100,000 and more than 300,000 deaths, alongside tens of thousands of documented rapes. A small group of Western missionaries, businessmen, and doctors who remained in the city organized a neutral safety zone that is credited with saving roughly 200,000 lives amid the violence. After the war ended, the Japanese general in overall command during the massacre, Ioane Matsui, was tried by an international war crimes tribunal in Tokyo, convicted for failing to stop the atrocities committed by soldiers under his command, and executed. The event remains a genuinely unresolved and painful source of tension in real China-Japan relations today, with many people in China continuing to feel that Japan has never issued a full or sincere enough apology, a sentiment that still surfaces regularly in Chinese media, film, and public commentary even decades later. Xi's anger in the scene, however exaggerated for comedy, is rooted in a real and serious piece of unresolved 20th century history, rather than being invented from nothing. Randy, never one to actually absorb information correctly, walks away from this phone call having scrambled the entire history lesson in his head. He later repeats what he heard to Thomas, Craig's still confused father, garbling the real historical event into a nonsense phrase, claiming that the Japanese got away with something he calls the rape of Don King, mixing up the real historical term for the Nanking Massacre with Don King, a real American boxing promoter who has nothing at all to do with the story. Thomas, drowning his confusion at a wine bar at this point in the episode, takes Randy's scrambled version of events completely at face value, since Randy presents himself throughout the season as someone whose politically correct credentials make him a trustworthy authority on nearly anything, regardless of how little he actually understands. What makes this scene genuinely different from anything involving Mao Zedong in the earlier seasons covered previously is that Xi Jinping is not simply standing in the background of someone else's joke. He is an active participant in the conversation, correcting a wrong assumption, expressing real anger tied to a real historical grievance, and getting a small but distinct personality moment of his own, all within the span of a single short phone call. Mao never spoke a single word across any of his appearances. Xi argues, corrects, and rants, giving the show's first sitting Chinese communist leader something Mao was never given across any of his earlier cameos: an actual voice and an actual emotional reaction. The show does not leave Xi's story there either. Later in the episode, during a closing montage set to music that shows several of the episode's various pairs finding some form of peace or affection with each other, mirroring the reconciliation happening between Tweek and Craig, Xi Jinping is shown back in his office, this time in an intimate moment with his secretary, the two of them appearing to be falling for each other in the same lighthearted spirit running through the rest of the episode's ending. It is a small throwaway beat, but it reinforces that Xi had, by this point in the episode, become an actual character with his own tiny thread running alongside everyone else's, rather than a name mentioned once and never returned to. The rest of the episode continues to build out its central joke about the yaoi fandom without much further need for Xi's involvement. Craig comes up with a plan to end the constant rumors and attention by having the two of them announce that they are gay and then immediately stage a fake public breakup, hoping that ending the relationship on their own terms will make everyone lose interest. Tweek, initially reluctant, gets swept up in playing the wronged party during the staged breakup, going so far as to invent a fictional person Craig supposedly cheated with, which backfires by making Craig deeply unpopular around school while giving the yaoi artists even more heartbroken material to work with. Meanwhile, Cartman spends the episode dealing with a fantasy version of himself called Cupid Me, a Cupid-like alter ego he had first imagined in an earlier season, who Cartman believes is helping repair Craig and Tweek's relationship using a magic love arrow, right up until the episode reveals that Cartman has been alone in his bathroom the entire time, hallucinating the whole storyline while masturbating. By the end of the episode, Tweek and Craig genuinely reconcile, apologizing to each other and beginning to hold hands and spend real time together in front of the whole town, which brings a wave of happiness back to South Park after the misery caused by their fake breakup. The show leaves their exact relationship intentionally a little unclear at first, but later seasons removed any doubt entirely. Episodes from season 21, along with the video game South Park The Fractured But Whole, confirm Tweek and Craig as a real, ongoing couple, and by the show's later post-COVID specials, the two characters are shown as a married couple, cementing what began as a joke about overeager fans into a permanent, accepted part of the show's own ongoing story. The episode was well received at the time it aired, though not every review agreed on exactly what it was doing well. IGN gave the episode a particularly strong score of 8.5 out of 10, naming it an editor's choice and calling it one of the funniest episodes of the show in recent memory for that reviewer personally. The AV Club was similarly positive, giving the episode a grade of A- and arguing that the story was ultimately less about mocking homophobia directly and more about a much broader target the show had returned to again and again over the years. People jumping onto a trend or a cause without bothering to actually research what they were talking about first. Den of Geek took a more mixed position, awarding the episode a lower score of 3 out of 5 stars, while still crediting the season's ongoing serialized structure for making even a lighter one-joke premise like this one feel connected to everything else happening around it. Matt Stone, who voices both Tweek and Craig, along with a large portion of the show's other male characters, received a Primetime Emmy nomination for Outstanding Character Voiceover Performance, specifically for his work in this episode at the 68th Primetime Creative Arts Emmy Awards. That recognition speaks to how much vocal range the episode demanded from him, voicing two characters going through very different emotional arcs within the same 22 minutes of television. Xi Jinping's phone call lasts only a couple of minutes of screen time inside a much longer episode focused mainly on two 9-year-old boys and an overzealous school fandom. It never mentions communism, government policy, or China's political system in any direct way, focusing entirely on real, specific, unresolved history between two countries instead. Even so, it marks a real turning point in how South Park was choosing to use China's leadership going forward, treating a living, sitting Communist Party leader as a character capable of holding an actual conversation, expressing actual anger, and reacting to an actual American parent's foolishness, rather than treating him as a name to drop for a quick visual gag the way Mao Zedong had always been used. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That willingness to let Xi Jinping actually talk on screen would not stay lighthearted for long. 4 years later, South Park would build an entire episode directly around the Chinese Communist Party itself, aiming a full storyline at government censorship rather than a passing joke about history, and the real government in Beijing would respond in a way no coffee shop owner, dodgeball team, or phone call ever had before. Section 5. Banned in China, Season 23, Episode 2, aired October 2nd, 2019. Direct confrontation with CCP censorship. Xi Jinping had already spoken once before, correcting Randy Marsh over the phone about the real origins of yaoi and losing his temper over old wartime history. 4 years later, he came back, but this time the joke was no longer a short phone call tucked inside a bigger story about two 9-year-old boys. An entire episode was now built around his government, his censors, and the price American companies were willing to pay to stay on his country's good side. That episode is called Banned in China. It is the second episode of Season 23 and the 299th episode of the show overall, written by series co-creator Trey Parker under the production production code 2302, and it premiered on Comedy Central on October 2nd, 2019. It follows directly from the previous week's episode, in which Kyle and Cartman had been sent to an immigration detention center, and Randy Marsh had already begun trying to expand his family's marijuana business, called Tegrity Farms, beyond South Park. Banned in China picks up that thread and takes it somewhere much bigger, sending Randy across the world to try to sell his product inside the largest untapped market he can imagine. The episode opens with Stan Marsh sitting in his room working on a song for a new death metal band he has started called Crimson Dawn. His father Randy bursts in to gather the whole family together and announce a new plan, telling them he intends to fly to China to expand Tegrity Farms into the Chinese market. When Randy boards his flight the next day, he quickly realizes he is far from the only person with this idea. Sitting around him on the plane are members of the fashion industry, real NBA players, including Houston Rockets star James Harden, and a large group of characters belonging to the Walt Disney Company, all traveling to China for the exact same reason, to expand their businesses into a country with well over 1 billion potential customers. The presence of real NBA players on that plane was not a random or empty joke. It directly referenced a genuine controversy playing out in the news at the very same time the episode aired, involving Houston Rockets general manager Daryl Morey, who had posted a message online supporting protesters in Hong Kong, triggering a real and serious backlash from Chinese businesses and government-linked media against the NBA. Randy's plans fall apart almost immediately after landing, when Chinese airport security discovers marijuana in his luggage and arrests him on the spot. He is sent to prison, where the episode shows him witnessing summary executions, and where he is subjected to forced labor, torture, and a formal process the show calls Communist Party re-education. Inside that prison, Randy meets 2 unexpected fellow inmates, Winnie the Pooh and his friend Piglet, both of whom explain that they ended up there because of an internet meme comparing Winnie the Pooh's appearance to that of China's president Xi Jinping. That detail is not something the show invented for a joke. A real meme comparing a heavier set, more casually dressed photograph of Xi Jinping to Winnie the Pooh actually began spreading across the Chinese internet years earlier, around 2013, and it continued gaining attention over time in a way that visibly displeased China's government. As a direct result, Chinese censors have restricted Winnie the Pooh content inside the country, and in 2018, China blocked the release of the live-action Disney film Christopher Robin specifically because of its connection to that same meme. Banned in China is dramatizing something that had genuinely happened, not manufacturing a fictional grievance out of nothing. At a formal hearing inside the prison, Randy speaks up and criticizes the Chinese government directly for how it treats the people locked up alongside him, accusing the system of lacking what he calls tegrity, his own invented word for integrity that gives his marijuana farm its name. Mickey Mouse, shown throughout the episode as the head of the Walt Disney Company, learns about Randy's public criticism and confronts him furiously, worried that Randy's comments could damage the business relationship Disney is trying to protect inside China. Despite Mickey's anger, Randy refuses to back down from his position, insisting that business should never be conducted through fear or intimidation, and he goes on to pitch Mickey on his original plan, bringing Tegrity Farms marijuana into the Chinese market together. Mickey's panic over one throwaway comment jeopardizing Disney's access to China is not an exaggeration invented purely for the joke. The real Walt Disney Company has a long, well-documented history of bending its own creative decisions specifically to avoid upsetting Chinese authorities, stretching back more than 2 decades before this episode ever aired. In 1997, Disney's Touchstone Pictures released Kundun, a film directed by Martin Scorsese about the early life of the Dalai Lama and China's takeover of Tibet. China's government reacted with real fury, and Disney's chief executive at the time, Michael Eisner, personally traveled to China to apologize to the country's leadership, all while simultaneously negotiating the deal that would eventually bring a Disney theme park to Shanghai. Nearly 2 decades later, when Marvel, now a Disney-owned studio, made the 2016 film Doctor Strange, the screenwriter openly admitted in interviews that a major character originally written in the comics as a Tibetan mystic was changed into a Celtic character specifically because keeping the character Tibetan risked upsetting the Chinese government, which does not recognize Tibet as a separate nation. Mickey Mouse yelling at Randy over a business relationship with China, in other words, is a fairly direct cartoon version of decisions Disney's own real executives have actually made. Randy and Mickey eventually present their joint proposal directly to Chinese officials, hoping to strike a deal that benefits both the Disney brand and Randy's farm. The officials reject the offer outright, and Mickey tells Randy the rejection has nothing to do with marijuana at all. According to Mickey, the Chinese government is still angry about the Winnie the Pooh situation, and until that particular problem goes away, no deal involving Disney is going to move forward. forward. Randy interprets this as a request to prove his loyalty in the clearest way he can think of. He lures Winnie the Pooh into a quiet alley using a pot of honey, and once Pooh is distracted eating it, Randy strangles him with a cable while a horrified Piglet watches the entire thing happen. With Pooh gone, the deal finally goes through. Integrity Weed becomes a legal product sold across China, bringing in enough money that a dump truck later arrives at the family farm to deliver an enormous pile of cash. While Randy's storyline plays out on the other side of the world, Stan's plot back home follows a parallel path built around the same basic idea, seen through the eyes of a 9-year-old rather than his father. Stan's band Crimson Dawn is approached by a music producer who wants to make a biographical film about them, explaining that traditional music formats like albums and tours no longer generate the kind of profit a movie deal can bring in. Stan is thrilled at first, seeing this as a real opportunity to finally leave South Park behind. That excitement fades quickly once the censorship process begins. The producer tells Stan that the film needs to appeal to audiences in China as well as America, which means specific subjects have to be removed from the script entirely, including any mention of Winnie the Pooh, homosexuality, organ transplants, or the idea that America is a free country. None of these restrictions were invented purely for comedy either. Each one reflects a real, documented category of content that Chinese censorship rules have actually restricted or blocked from films released inside the country, based on established reporting on how Chinese film censorship works in practice. Even films with no connection to Disney have run into the exact same wall. The 2013 film World War Z originally included a scene in which characters discussed the possibility that the pandemic driving the story's zombie outbreak had originated in China, and the studio behind it removed that scene before release, a decision former United States Attorney General William Barr later pointed to publicly as an example of American entertainment companies editing their own work to avoid offending the Chinese government, even though the film still never received a Chinese release at all despite the cut. The censorship inside the episode escalates even further once filming actually begins. Chinese officials are shown physically present on set, reviewing content in real time to make sure nothing crosses their approved lines. In one particularly pointed scene, Stan sits alone in his bedroom trying to write the script, only for a Chinese censor to appear standing directly over his shoulder, erasing lines from the page as fast as Stan can write them. Frustrated and defeated, Stan eventually admits to his bandmates that the only version of their story that will ever actually get approved for release is one that has been stripped down into something completely bland and harmless, since anything with genuine substance or edge gets rejected before it ever reaches an audience. It is at this exact moment, watching his own creative work get hollowed out piece by piece, that Kyle Broflovsky and Eric Cartman return home, stepping off a bus following their own separate ordeal at an immigration detention center from the previous episode. Seeing his friends again after everything they had just gone through gives Stan a jolt of clarity about his own situation. Rather than continuing to compromise his band's identity to chase a shot at Chinese approval, Stan changes course entirely during filming, explaining that no matter how badly he wants to leave the family farm behind, he cannot bring himself to give up his integrity for China, adding that anyone who would make that trade in his position is worthless. That decision stands in direct contrast to the choice his own father made only scenes earlier, when Randy killed a defenseless, beloved character purely to protect a business deal. The episode closes back at the Marsh family farm, where a truck unloads a massive delivery of cash earned from Integrity Weed's new legal status inside China. Sitting down for a family meal, Stan notices that his father is covered head to toe in a strange combination of honey and blood, and puts the pieces together out loud, asking Randy directly what happened. Randy simply confirms that he killed Winnie the Pooh. Stan does not yell, argue, or lecture his father about what he has just admitted. He calmly gets up from the table and walks away to go write another song, this time about his father, letting the silence of that reaction carry more weight than any spoken argument could have. The world banned in China depicts around Randy's imprisonment is exaggerated for comedy, but the discomfort underneath the exaggeration is rooted in real, documented reporting rather than invented horror. Human rights organizations, including Amnesty International, have described real detention and re-education facilities operating inside China, reporting that as many as 1 million people, many belonging to ethnic groups such as Uyghurs and Kazakhs, have been held in these facilities, which Amnesty International has described using language evoking some of the darkest periods of China's earlier Mao-era history. China's government has downplayed or denied the existence of these facilities in the form international reporting describes them. The episode never claims to be a documentary, and it exaggerates events for the sake of a joke the same way South Park always has. But the underlying subject it is joking about is a real and seriously documented issue rather than pure fiction expression invented for shock value. Real-world economics sit underneath the entire episode as well. China's population sits at roughly 1.4 billion people, making it an enormous potential customer base that plenty of real American companies actively compete to access, supported by an entire consulting industry built specifically around helping foreign businesses navigate their way into the Chinese market. China's formal entry into the World Trade Organization back in 2001 only deepened this pool for American companies looking to grow overseas. Randy's fictional decision to chase Chinese approval for his marijuana business mirrors a decision plenty of real companies have genuinely made, weighing potential profit in China against the demands and restrictions that come attached to it. Critics responded to the episode with a genuinely mixed but largely thoughtful set of reactions once it aired. A writer for Forbes described the episode as both funny and quietly troubling at the same time, pointing specifically to the contrast between Stan's choice to protect his integrity and Randy's choice to place profit above principle, as the clearest expression of what the episode was actually trying to say. A reviewer for Den of Geek felt less convinced, giving the episode a low score, and criticizing what he saw as weak plotting layered underneath shock humor that had grown tired. A writer for Salon took a more favorable position, arguing that the episode raised a legitimate point about how much the American entertainment industry has been willing to compromise its own values in order to keep access to Chinese audiences and Chinese money. The AV Club gave the episode a solid grade, calling it a confident, well-constructed piece of television willing to take on a genuinely large target. Even outside entertainment journalism, a professor at the United States Air Force Academy wrote favorably about the episode for a publication called the Modern War Institute, framing it as a meaningful example of how information and public messaging around China had begun shifting inside American culture. Randy's storyline in Banned in China never once uses the word communism, and neither does Stan's. The episode is built entirely around censorship, business pressure, and the real choices companies make when a massive foreign market and a government's approval both come with strings attached. Even so, the entire plot only exists because of the specific kind of government South Park chose as its target, one capable of banning a beloved children's character over an unflattering comparison, and one powerful enough that even a company as large as Disney would rather sacrifice its own values than risk losing access to it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That target did not stay silent for long after the episode aired. Within days, the real Chinese government responded to Banned in China in a way no coffee shop owner, dodgeball opponent, or phone call had ever managed before. And South Park's own creators had something to say about it too. Section 6. The Real-World Fallout. China's total ban and the mock apology. The response did not take long to arrive, and it was not a statement, a warning, or a formal complaint through diplomatic channels. It was erasure. Within days of Banned in China airing, every visible trace of South Park began disappearing from the Chinese internet, as though the show itself had been sent to the same kind of camp Randy Marsh had just been shown surviving on screen. The Hollywood Reporter was the first major outlet to document exactly how far this reaction went, and the details it uncovered were specific enough to leave little room for doubt about what had happened. A search of Weibo, the Chinese social media platform often compared to Twitter, turned up not a single mention of South Park anywhere among billions of existing posts on the service. On Youku, a major Chinese streaming platform owned by the internet company Alibaba, every link to every clip, episode, and full season of the show had gone dead. On Baidu's Tieba, at the time, China's largest online discussion platform, the threads and subthreads where fans had once talked about the show had stopped working entirely, replaced instead with a message explaining that the section was temporarily closed according to relevant law and regulation. Anyone typing in the old web address for what used to be a South Park discussion board found the same blank wall waiting for them. Once the Hollywood Reporter published its findings, the story spread quickly through American media. CNN, CNBC, Salon, The Hill, the outlet Mike, and CBS News all picked up the reporting within roughly the same week, turning what had started as one animated episode into a genuine international news story about censorship, entertainment, and the price of doing business with China. Search results for the show on Baidu, China's dominant search engine, reportedly stopped returning anything current, leaving an old promotional video from 2017 as the most recent result anyone could find. There is an important detail buried underneath all of this that makes the situation slightly more complicated than a simple story of a government canceling a show it had once allowed. South Park had never actually been officially broadcast inside mainland China in the first place, even though unofficial Mandarin and Cantonese dubbed versions of the show had circulated there for years. What the Chinese government moved against following Banned in China was not an official broadcast deal being torn up, since no such deal existed to begin with. It was the far less official ecosystem of fan uploads, discussion threads, streaming mirrors, and search results that had allowed the show to exist inside China anyway, entirely outside any approved distribution channel. Wiping that unofficial presence away did not require canceling a contract. It only required deleting everything at once, which is precisely what appears to have happened. The consequences reached beyond China's own borders as well. Reports at the time indicated that Apple, which does significant business with Chinese manufacturers and Chinese consumers alike, had become noticeably less interested in bidding on the streaming rights to South Park once this controversy broke, according to sources who spoke to Bloomberg News. A major American technology company weighing whether to attach its name to a show that had just triggered a total blackout inside one of its most important markets is itself a small but real piece of evidence showing how far this fallout actually traveled, well past the borders of the story South Park had originally told. South Park was not entering entirely unfamiliar territory either. Real American entertainment has run into this exact wall before, in ways that help explain why Chinese officials reacted with such speed and totality. Disney's own 1997 film Kundun, about the early life of the Dalai Lama, provoked such anger from Beijing that the company's chief executive personally traveled to China to apologize while negotiating a theme park deal at the same time. The 2018 Disney film Christopher Robin, built around Winnie the Pooh, never received a Chinese release at all because of the same meme this episode was directly satirizing. Measured against that history, South Park joining the list of American entertainment properties that China has moved to block or erase was not an unprecedented event so much as a new entry in an already established pattern, distinguished mainly by how openly and immediately Parker and Stone chose to respond to it in public. Trey Parker and Matt Stone did not respond to any of this quietly. On October 7th, 2019, the official South Park account on Twitter posted what it called an official apology to China. The tone of the statement made clear from its very first line that no actual apology was being offered. It compared its own situation directly to the NBA, saying that South Park, just like the basketball league, welcomed Chinese censorship into its home and into its heart, and joked that the show, like the NBA, valued money over freedom and democracy. It went on to sarcastically insist that China's president looked nothing at all like Winnie the Pooh, before pivoting into a plug for the show's upcoming 300th episode airing that Wednesday, then closing with an exaggerated show of loyalty toward China's ruling Communist Party and a wish for a strong autumn harvest, ending by casually asking whether the two sides were square now. None of this makes sense without understanding the real controversy it was directly mocking, and that controversy was substantial enough to dominate American sports news for the better part of 2 weeks. On October 4th, 2019, Houston Rockets general manager Daryl Morey posted a brief message on social media voicing support for Hong Kong's pro-democracy protesters and their fight for freedom, then deleted it not long after. The financial response from China was immediate and coordinated. Tencent, which had signed a 5-year, $1.5 billion deal only months earlier to stream NBA games across China, suspended its broadcasts of Houston Rockets games, and China's state broadcaster CCTV announced it would halt its own preseason coverage entirely. Within days, roughly a dozen Chinese companies with sponsorship ties to the NBA or the Rockets specifically, including well-known sneaker brands, a smartphone manufacturer, an electronics company, a coffee chain, and a car rental service, all issued public statements cutting ties with the league. The scale of what was at stake became clearer once real viewership numbers came out. More than 600 million people in China had watched NBA games on Chinese television during the previous season, with close to 500 million more watching through Tencent's platforms. And China was already estimated to account for roughly 10% of the league's total revenue, with some analysts projecting that share could double by 2030. NBA Commissioner Adam Silver tried to defend the league's commitment to free expression while limiting the financial damage, stating publicly that Morey retained the right to express his own views, and later revealing that Chinese officials had directly asked him to fire Morey, a request Silver said he refused. Rocket star James Harden, whose personal endorsement deals depend heavily on the Chinese market, issued his own separate apology reaffirming his affection for Chinese fans, and LeBron James weighed in publicly more than a week later, suggesting Morey had likely not been well informed about the situation in Hong Kong before posting, a comment that drew its own wave of criticism back in the United States. The backlash inside America was not confined to sports commentary either. Missouri Senator Josh Hawley publicly criticized the NBA's cautious handling of the episode, pointing directly to China's own human rights record, including the mass detention of ethnic minorities and its crackdown on Hong Kong demonstrators administrators as reasons the league's talk of easing cultural tensions rang hollow. The NBA's own response to that backlash, widely seen by critics as cautious and apologetic in an effort to protect its business interests in China, became the exact target Parker and Stone were mocking by comparing their own real censorship to the NBA's handling of Maury's tweet. The core joke inside Banned in China, the Winnie the Pooh comparison that had gotten Randy's fictional prison mates banned, was also rooted in something that had genuinely been happening online for years before the episode ever aired. A meme comparing photographs of Xi Jinping to the physical shape of Winnie the Pooh had circulated across Chinese social media in different waves over multiple years, with one especially notable moment coming when people online compared a photograph of Xi Jinping walking alongside then-President Barack Obama to Winnie the Pooh walking beside his friend Tigger. Different reports place the intensity of this comparison at slightly different points across the 2000s, but the through line across all of them is consistent. The joke was real, it kept resurfacing, and Chinese censors kept responding to it by removing Winnie the Pooh content rather than letting the comparison fade on its own. The prison scenes inside Banned in China carried a heavier layer of real-world weight underneath their comedy as well, one that several outlets covering the ban made a point of spelling out plainly. The forced labor camp Randy is shown surviving was widely understood by critics and reporters at the time as a direct reference to real detention and re-education facilities that multiple human rights organizations and journalists, including reporting from the New York Times, have documented operating inside China's Xinjiang region, primarily holding Uyghur Muslims and other ethnic minorities. According to official planning documents reported on by the New York Times, the stated purpose behind these real facilities was to produce what was described as a disciplined, Chinese-speaking industrial workforce, loyal to the Communist Party and to factory employers. South Park's version of this inside the episode is exaggerated for comedy, involving summary executions and a run-in with a fictional talking bear. But the real institution it is built on top of is a documented and serious part of the actual news record from this same period. Parker and Stone did not treat the mock apology as the end of their response either. Exactly 1 week after Banned in China aired, on October 9th, 2019, South Park released its 300th episode overall, titled Shots. In that episode, Randy is confronted by Towley, his business partner at Tegrity Farms, who criticizes him harshly for continuing to profit from a business relationship with the Chinese government while ignoring its human rights record. Randy, desperate not to lose Towley as a partner, first tries to get away with quietly mumbling an apology under his breath. When that clearly isn't convincing enough, Randy commits fully, shouting an angry, direct insult aimed squarely at the Chinese government, loud enough that Towley finally believes he means it. That single shouted line, arriving exactly 1 week after China had scrubbed the show from its internet, generated its own fresh round of media coverage, framed by outlets at the time not as South Park backing down after being censored, but as Parker and Stone doubling down even harder in direct response to it. The show kept circling back to this same conflict well beyond that 1 week stretch in October of 2019. In a later special, Randy is shown recalling previously unmentioned details from his original trip to China, adding a new and characteristically absurd twist to the story that ties his behavior there directly into the origins of the real-world COVID-19 pandemic. In a separate Halloween-themed special released after the ban had already taken hold, Randy is shown mocking Xi Jinping again during the special's opening, making clear that South Park had no real intention of quietly retreating from this particular fight just because one government had tried to erase it from an entire country's internet. Taken together, the timeline here is unusually fast and unusually public for a single episode of television. An episode airs criticizing censorship. Within days, an entire country's internet has visibly scrubbed the show from existence. The show's own creators respond publicly with a joke sharp enough to make international news on its own. A week later, the show's landmark 300th episode doubles down with an even blunter insult aimed at the same government. Few other episodes covered in this video carry anything close to that kind of immediate, documented, real-world back and forth, playing out in the news cycle in close to real time rather than being debated only after the fact by critics and historians. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Every part of this chain of events grew directly out of a single episode built around Chinese government censorship. But South Park's relationship with communism as a subject did not stay confined to what was happening on the other side of the world. Only a year later, the show would turn its attention much closer to home, building an entire storyline around an American company, an actual worker uprising, and a fictional character who starts openly quoting Karl Marx on screen. Section 7, Unfulfilled, Season 22, Episode 9, aired December 5th, 2018. Marxist rhetoric enters the show directly. South Park had already spent years poking at communism from a distance, using a foreign government, a foreign leader, and a handful of historical figures who never lived anywhere near Colorado. Unfulfilled changes the geography completely. This time, the target sits much closer to home, built entirely around an American company, an American small town, and a badly injured American warehouse worker who ends up speaking more like a university lecture on Karl Marx than anyone else who has ever appeared on the show. Unfulfilled is the 9th episode of season 22 and the 296th episode of the series overall, airing on Comedy Central on December 5th, 2018. It served as the first half of a two-part story that closed out the season, continuing directly into the following week's finale. The premise driving the whole episode was pulled straight from real news happening at the exact same time it aired. Throughout 2018, Amazon had run a highly publicized nationwide competition among American cities, all vying to be chosen as the location for the company's planned second headquarters. A real business story that dominated local news coverage across the country for months. Unfulfilled imagines a version of that same real competition playing out, except this time the winning town is South Park itself, which lands a massive new Amazon fulfillment center instead of a second headquarters. The episode opens on a much smaller, more personal storyline before any of the Amazon drama takes over. Butterscotch is excited about the town's upcoming bike parade, buying accessories to decorate his bike in hopes of winning the contest's cash prize. His father, Steven, has recently taken a job as a floor manager at the new Amazon fulfillment center, and the stress of that job has visibly worn him down, leading him to snap angrily at Butters early in the episode over what initially seems like nothing. The reason becomes clear soon enough. Steven is being worked to the point of exhaustion, and he is far from alone. Many other residents of South Park have taken jobs at the same facility, and the arrival of the center has already begun eliminating other kinds of work around town, as more and more local businesses close down once people start buying everything they need online instead. To underline exactly how grinding this new work has become, the episode sets an early montage of fulfillment center employees going through their daily routine to the real song 16 Tons, a well-known American recording most famously performed by Merle Travis, describing the exhausting, repetitive life of a coal miner who works himself into permanent debt to the company he works for and can never fully escape. Pairing that specific song with footage of Amazon employees filling orders, taking short breaks, filling more orders, then carpooling home only to repeat the same cycle again the next day, draws a direct, deliberate line between a real historical form of exploited industrial labor and the modern warehouse job the show is depicting on screen. The event that actually sets the episode's main conflict in motion is an accident. A worker named Josh Carter, one of Steven's coworkers at the fulfillment center, is grabbed by a sorting robot and physically compressed down into the size and shape of a small shipping package. Amazon's official response to the incident is to blame it entirely on human error, refusing to accept any responsibility for how the accident happened in the first place. That corporate response is the final straw for the facility's workers, who erupt in outrage and immediately go on strike, refusing to keep working until something changes. The strike brings the entire fulfillment center to a standstill, which in turn stops every delivery expected by everyone in town, leading the rest of South Park's residents, now completely dependent on the service, to form an angry counter-protest demanding the striking workers go back to work so their packages can arrive on schedule. While all of that unfolds around him, Butter's storyline with his friends continues moving in its own direction. Stan, Kyle, Cartman, and Kenny initially think the whole idea of the bike parade is silly and beneath their interest, dismissing Butters' excitement about it outright. Their attitude shifts the moment they run into Larry Zawiski, a smug former winner of the parade who is still coasting on the popularity that victory earned him. Seeing exactly how much social status a single bike parade win can generate, the boys quickly reconsider their earlier dismissal and decide to enter together as a group, building one unified theme across all of their bikes in hopes of winning the prize for themselves. Their plan runs directly into a problem created by the very strike unfolding elsewhere in town, since the shutdown at the fulfillment center means none of the accessories they were counting on ordering online can actually arrive in time for the parade. Desperate for supplies, the boys head to the old South Park Mall, a location that has clearly fallen into total disrepair since online shopping took over. Wandering its mostly empty halls, they discover that a handful of employees still working there have undergone strange, visible mutations after years of standing around with almost no customers ever coming through the doors. These employees, however unsettling to look at, are also completely unable to offer the boys the kind of broad selection and instant availability that online shopping through Amazon has trained everyone in town to expect as the new normal, leaving Stan and his friends without a real solution to their problem. With no other options left, Stan takes the extraordinary step of contacting Jeff Bezos directly, offering a deal. If Bezos will personally arrange to ship the bike parade supplies the boys need ahead of everyone else's stalled orders, Stan will convince the strange mutated mall workers to go to work as replacement boxers inside the paralyzed fulfillment center, helping get deliveries moving again during the strike. Bezos agrees to the arrangement without hesitation. Once the striking workers learn what has just been arranged behind their backs, using outside labor to undercut their own strike, Josh, still trapped and shipped inside his own package, makes the decision to lead his fellow workers directly into what the episode frames as the start of an actual revolution, setting up the unresolved conflict that the following week's episode would have to pick up and finish. Jeff Bezos himself is given a specific and pointed visual design throughout the episode, rather than simply appearing as an ordinary businessman. He is drawn as a pale, large-headed, large-eyed humanoid figure, closely modeled on the Talosians, an alien species that originally appeared in the unaired 1965 pilot episode of the original Star Trek television series. In that early piece of Star Trek history, the Talosians are a manipulative, illusion-casting species who lure the crew of the Starship Enterprise to their home planet using a fake distress signal, hoping to trap and control them once they arrive. South Park's version of Bezos borrows heavily from that same design and that same sense of quiet, calculated menace, communicating with people around him through telepathy rather than ordinary speech, and relying on a small army of Alexa smart speaker devices scattered through people's homes to secretly listen in on private conversations happening all across town. That surveillance ends up mattering directly to the plot. Bezos personally visits Mayor McDaniels to discuss the strike, framing the entire situation around a simple, blunt priority, insisting that satisfying the customer matters more than anything else happening in town. When the mayor hesitates to act against her own striking constituents, Bezos threatens to cancel her personal Amazon Prime membership if the strike and its delivery delays are not resolved quickly. Rather than risk losing that membership, Mayor McDaniels backs down completely, effectively handing control over decisions in South Park directly to Bezos, rather than continuing to run the town on her own authority. A small but telling detail about exactly how much leverage the episode imagines this kind of corporation holding over an entire local government. The episode's sharpest and most quoted material, though, comes through Josh Carter himself, delivered entirely from inside the small shipping box he remains trapped in for the rest of the episode. In one scene, a local news reporter interviews Josh live, asking how it feels to have his accident spark so much unrest across town. Josh responds by explaining, in language pulled almost directly from basic Marxist economic theory, that something like this outcome was always inevitable, describing a world divided between a small group at the top who control the tools and resources used to produce goods, and a much larger working class who only survives by selling its own labor for wages, adding that whenever real conflict breaks out between these two groups, those at the top typically try to shift the blame onto the workers below them rather than accept responsibility themselves. Later in the episode, Josh directly confronts Randy Marsh, asking him whether he even cares that ordinary people's personal worth is being reduced by capitalists down to nothing more than a number representing exchange value. Randy brushes the question off sarcastically, dismissing Josh's entire argument as exactly the kind of predictable rhetoric anyone would expect from what he mockingly calls a Marxist box. Josh refuses to back down from the exchange, insisting that free trade is not the same thing as freedom, and suggesting outright that socialism might actually be the real answer to the problem everyone in town is dealing with. By the time the episode reaches its ending, Josh is actively urging the striking Amazon workers around him toward outright revolution, using language built around historical class struggle, worker alienation, and the eventual necessity of tearing down the existing economic order entirely, with the workers around him appearing willing to follow wherever he leads them next. This kind of dialogue represents a genuinely new direction for the show, one that reviewers noticed and commented on directly once the episode aired. A review from the AV Club specifically pointed out that by its second half, the episode stops merely hinting at socialist ideas through subtext and starts stating them outright, describing Josh's transformation into an openly Marxist mouthpiece as a deliberate, unmistakable shift in tone. That same review drew a direct contrast with an earlier South Park episode from season 8 called Something Walmart This Way Comes, which had argued that boycotting a large retail chain like Walmart accomplishes nothing meaningful, since another identical big box store would simply move in and take its place regardless of what any one town decided to do. Unfulfilled takes a noticeably different position from that earlier episode, treating organized worker resistance as something something with real disruptive power rather than as a pointless gesture against an unstoppable system. A shift the AV Club's own review explicitly flagged as surprising coming from these particular creators. Critical reaction to the episode leaned heavily positive overall. The AV Club gave Unfulfilled a grade of A-, with its reviewer stating outright that the episode left them genuinely stunned, going as far as comparing its impact to the show's earlier decision to bring back the Man-Bear-Pig character, specifically to acknowledge and correct mistakes made in his original appearance years before. IGN also reviewed the episode favorably, giving it a strong numerical score and praising how effectively it combined real dramatic weight with plenty of its own science fiction elements layered on top. Not every response treated the episode's politics as an unqualified success. A detailed analysis published by the World Socialist website took the episode very seriously as a piece of political commentary, arguing that its comic elements were giving voice to real, serious economic conditions echoing the industrial hardship of the 1930s, alongside a real resurgence of labor organizing that the site's writer felt actually threatens today's existing economic order. That same analysis suggested Parker and Stone appeared somewhat conflicted or unsure of their own argument by the episode's end, noting that the story ultimately resolves its tension through the town discovering a shared, mellowing enthusiasm for locally grown marijuana, rather than through any lasting political change, which the reviewer read as evidence the show's writers were engaging with ideas that ran further than they were fully prepared to commit to. Unfulfilled ends without any real resolution to the central standoff it spends its entire runtime building. The striking Amazon workers, now openly following Josh's call toward revolution, are set on a direct collision course with the mutated mall workers Stan has just convinced to take their place inside the fulfillment center as replacement labor. Nothing about how that confrontation plays out or what happens to Josh, Bezos, Steven, or the striking workers next gets settled by the time the credits roll. All of it was left entirely in the hands of whatever episode came next. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That next episode is where the season, the strike, and Josh's call for revolution would finally have to land somewhere, whether that meant victory for the workers, defeat, or some entirely different outcome nobody watching the first half of this story could have easily predicted. Section 8, Bike Parade, Season 22, Episode 10, aired December 12th, 2018. The arc's resolution Unfulfilled ended with striking Amazon workers ready to clash with a group of mutated mall employees being brought in to replace them, and with Josh Carter still trapped inside his own shipping box calling for revolution. None of that gets a clean resolution in Bike Parade. What actually happens instead involves a kidnapping, a killing carried out by tricking small children, and a town that ends up uniting behind marijuana rather than any clear pabeda for either side of the labor dispute. Bike Parade is the 10th and final episode of Season 22, the 297th episode of the series overall, and it aired on Comedy Central on December 12th, 2018, 1 week after Unfulfilled. It closes out the season's two-part finale arc and pulls together several storylines the season had been building all along, something reviewers noted was unusual for a show that typically avoids this much ongoing continuity between episodes. Kenny McCormick's storyline becomes one of the episode's central threads early on. His father, Stuart, is furious that Kenny has been helping Amazon rather than boycotting the company alongside the striking workers, since Kenny had personally helped convince the mutated mall employees to work as replacement boxers at the fulfillment center during the strike in the previous episode. Under that pressure, Kenny grows genuinely uncomfortable with his own role in propping up the very commercialism the strikers are fighting against. He tells Stan, Kyle, and Cartman that he will not be joining them in the upcoming Bike Parade after all, choosing solidarity with the striking workers over the group project the four of them had been building bikes for. His decision leaves the other three boys panicking since they had been counting on entering the parade together as a team and now fear they cannot compete without him. Steven Stotch, Butters' father and the fulfillment center's floor manager, faces his own version of this same conflict. After discovering that Josh has mysteriously disappeared, Steven is torn between joining his coworkers on the picket line and continuing to provide for his own family, especially Butters, who is overjoyed at having just received a new bike for the parade and has no idea anything is wrong. Butters tries to convince his father that the family does not need anything more than what they already have, but Steven ultimately decides to keep working rather than strike, spending his days training the former mall employees on how to properly package items as their replacement labor inside the fulfillment center. Randy Marsh's marijuana business, Tegrity Farms, ends up benefiting directly from the stress the strike is causing across town. As tension builds among the striking workers, more and more of them start turning to Randy's farm to buy weed as a way of coping with everything happening around them, and business at the farm suddenly booms in a way it hadn't before. When Randy grows worried about losing customers to competing farms, especially given a rule limiting him to selling only 1 ounce at a time, his friend Tally suggests they start offering their own delivery service, using the electric scooters that had begun appearing around South Park earlier that same season, a direct callback to an earlier episode from earlier in the season called The Scoots. Meanwhile, the strike itself keeps escalating well beyond South Park's own town limits. Josh, still stuck inside his box from the accident in the previous episode, delivers a public speech about the struggles of working people, then travels all the way to Washington, D.C. in an effort to build broader national support for the strike rather than keeping it contained to one small town's local dispute. Jeff Bezos, continuing to monitor everything happening in South Park through the Alexa devices installed in people's homes, watches all of these developments play out in real time, including Kenny's open support for the strikers and Stewart's anger at his son for briefly working against them. Rather than treating the striking workers as a whole as his real problem, Bezos zeroes in specifically on Josh as the one person actually responsible for organizing and sustaining the resistance against him. Bezos concludes that Josh represents the true threat to his business and decides the situation calls for having him removed entirely. What follows is one of the darkest turns the episode takes. Bezos arranges to have Josh kidnapped, then gathers a small group of unsuspecting children and tells them that Josh's box contains gifts meant for the bike parade, or in some versions of the scene, Christmas presents. Excited by the promise of gifts, the children rip the box open without any idea of what is actually inside, and the sudden opening causes Josh's already compressed body to violently give way, killing him instantly right in front of them. Mayor McDaniels, the same official who had originally convinced Bezos to bring his fulfillment center to South Park in the first place, personally witnesses this happen, and the horror of watching a real death caused this directly by Bezos marks the turning point where her loyalty to him finally breaks. Back with the boys, Stan, Kyle, and Cartman realize they have no real path to winning the bike parade without Kenny on their team, and Cartman comes up with a plan to get the entire event canceled outright by claiming that holding it at all would be offensive given everything happening in town. A plan that ultimately goes nowhere. Determined to get the parade called off through official channels instead, the boys head to City Hall to make their case directly to Mayor McDaniels, only to find Jeff Bezos sitting behind her desk instead, having effectively taken over her role entirely. Bezos explains to the boys exactly why the bike parade had mattered so much to him from the very beginning. According to his own account, the parade had been useful specifically because it drove local Amazon purchases, and because purchases like these had convinced ordinary townspeople who wanted what he calls fulfillment to go take jobs at his fulfillment center in the first place, revealing that even something as small and innocent looking as a children's bike contest had quietly served his larger business interests all along. Spotting Kenny among the boys and recognizing his open support for the strikers as a genuine threat to his operation, Bezos casually instructs his Alexa device to kill Kenny on the spot, treating the order with the same flat, business-like tone he uses for everything else in the episode. Before that order can be carried out, the entire town's population shows up together at City Hall to confront Bezos directly. Randy steps forward and tells him plainly that the whole town now has what he calls tegrity, using his own homemade word built around his marijuana farm's brand, and that every single worker has already quit the fulfillment center for good. Rather than continuing to negotiate or bargain with Bezos the way individual characters had been doing throughout both episodes, the town acts as one unified group, collectively forcing Bezos and the rest of his Amazon executives out of South Park entirely. With Bezos gone, the bike parade goes forward exactly as originally planned, though its outcome carries real weight from everything that happened leading up to it. Cartman participates by pulling Kenny's coffin behind his own bike, continuing the show's long-running joke about Kenny's frequent deaths, while the rest of the town returns to something closer to its normal rhythm now that Bezos and the fulfillment center's control over daily life has been lifted. The resolution the episode lands on comes not through any clear victory for organized labor, a union contract, or anything resembling the revolution Josh had spent the previous episode calling for. It comes instead through the entire town bonding over locally grown marijuana, discovering a shared, mellow solidarity that has nothing to do with class struggle or seizing the means of production, even after all of that language had been front and center just one episode earlier. Critics responded to the finale with a generally positive but noticeably more mixed reaction than the episode before it. IGN's review gave Bike Parade a rating of 6.9 out of 10, describing the episode as merely okay, while specifically noting surprise at how many direct references to earlier episodes in the season appeared throughout the finale, calling this kind of ongoing continuity unusually rare for how South Park normally operates from week to week. The AV Club's review took a more favorable position, awarding the episode a B+, and praising the season finale specifically for its ability to tie together storylines that had seemed unrelated earlier in the season, including threads many viewers might have assumed were already abandoned. That same review singled out a specific scene where several of Bezos's former employees are shown deliberately looking away from him during a confrontation as one of the biggest laughs of the entire season, and separately praised Butters for strutting proudly alongside his bike earlier in the episode. The review's own title summed up its overall read on the episode plainly, framing the outcome as marijuana succeeding where direct confrontation with Bezos could not. On IMDb, the episode holds a general audience score of roughly 7.6 out of 10, reflecting a solid but not universally glowing reception among viewers who watched it. Beyond simple review scores, the episode's ending drew a more divided set of interpretations regarding what it was actually trying to say about labor and capitalism. Some commentary, sympathetic to the striking workers, including the same World Socialist website analysis that had taken Unfulfilled seriously as political commentary, praised the two-part arc overall for dramatizing real exploitative warehouse conditions and treating organized worker resistance as a legitimate response to genuine corporate mistreatment. Other critical readings pushed back against that same interpretation, arguing that the finale ultimately undercuts its own worker solidarity messaging by focusing heavily on how disruptive the strike becomes for ordinary consumers, and by resolving the entire conflict through Randy's marijuana business succeeding as an entrepreneur rather than through any kind of clear union victory, with Josh himself, the character who had spent the previous episode quoting Marx directly, ending up killed off entirely rather than vindicated. Whichever reading a viewer walks away with, the plain facts of how the story ends are not really in dispute. Josh dies, Kenny's stand costs him nothing but a spot in the bike parade, and even that gets settled once the town turns on Bezos as a whole. The workers never get anything resembling a formal contract, a union, or lasting change to how the fulfillment center actually operates. What they get instead is a billionaire chased out of town by a crowd that found something else entirely to bond over instead, leaving plenty of room for critics and commentators to argue afterward about exactly what kind of political statements, if any, South Park had actually intended to make. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That argument did not stay confined to a handful of reviews written in the days right after the episode aired either. It grew into a much larger, ongoing conversation among critics and commentators asking whether South Park itself, the same show built for 2 decades around refusing to pick a side, had quietly started leaning somewhere it had never openly leaned before. Section 9. Critical reception debate. Did South Park turn anti-capitalist? Josh dying inside his own shipping box and the town choosing marijuana over a labor victory did not end the conversation Unfulfilled and Bike Parade had started. If anything, that ending only sharpened a question critics had already begun asking the moment the first episode aired, one that reached far beyond a single 2-part story. For a show that had spent more than 20 years refusing to be pinned down politically, entire outlets were now asking, in print and on camera, whether South Park had finally picked a side. The clearest piece of evidence anyone pointing to a real ideological identity behind the show could reach for was not a guess or an inference. It was something Trey Parker and Matt Stone had said themselves, on record, years earlier. In 2006, appearing before an audience gathered by the magazine Reason in Amsterdam, the two creators were asked directly whether any political label fit them, and their answer was libertarian, making this one of the very few moments where either man attached a specific ideological word to himself rather than simply calling the show an equal opportunity offender and leaving it there. That single admission became the anchor for a Salon piece published the same week Unfulfilled aired, arguing that mocking Amazon this directly felt like a real departure from everything the show's own creators had said about themselves. The Salon piece did not rely only on that 2006 quote to make its case. It pointed to a specific string of earlier episodes as supporting evidence, each one held up as proof of the show's historical leanings. Gnomes, covered earlier in this video, was the first example cited. A second example came from an episode called The Entity, which aired in 2001 and, according to Salon's own characterization, treated the government bailout given to airlines that year as a reward for lazy workers whose own poor habits had left their industry deserving to fail in the first place. A third example came from an episode called Faith Hilling, which aired in 2012 during that year's presidential primary season, and which Salon described as portraying Ron Paul, a candidate widely associated with limited government and free market economics, as the only reasonable Republican running in the race that year. Taken together, these 3 episodes form the backbone of Salon's argument that the show had spent decades leaning towards skepticism of big government and sympathy toward free market capitalism, making Unfulfilled's sudden turn toward organized labor and open criticism of a real billionaire feel genuinely surprising by comparison. Salon's own framing of the situation stopped short of declaring the matter settled. The piece explicitly noted that until the second half of the story aired the following week, it would remain unclear whether South Park had truly abandoned its earlier point of view in favor of a pro-labor stance, or whether this was simply one unusually sharp episode rather than a real, lasting shift. Even while raising the question forcefully, the writer left real room for the answer to go either way, treating the episode as a meaningful data point rather than final proof of anything. The AV Club took the comparison even further by putting Gnomes and Unfulfilled directly side by side within a single review. Its writer walked back through Gnomes in detail, reminding readers that the Underpants Gnomes episode had built its entire argument around the idea that big corporations are fundamentally good, since companies only grow large by offering products people genuinely want to buy, using the real Starbucks parody at the center of that story as living proof of the point. The same review then described that message as arguably the single most openly pro-capitalist statement the show had ever made across its entire run, before turning to Unfulfilled and describing it as a startling opposite number swinging hard in the other direction. Putting these 2 episodes next to each other, released 2 decades apart, gave the argument about the show's shifting politics its cleanest and most concrete piece of internal evidence, since both episodes came from the exact same writers working inside the exact same fictional town. Forbes added its own version of this same observation from a slightly different angle, focusing less on the show's history and more on what was actually coming out of Josh's mouth while he sat trapped inside his own shipping container. The review described his dialogue plainly as modern-day Marxism, delivered in a neatly wrapped corporate package, and pointed out the darkly comic detail that the reporters interviewing him on camera seemed far more interested in questions about the box itself than in anything he was actually trying to say about labor and capital. That framing mattered because it came from an entertainment reviewer focused purely on the episode's craft and comedy, not from a political commentary outlet with an obvious rooting interest in the outcome, showing that even critics with no particular ideological stake in the debate were noticing the same pattern everyone else had spotted. This conversation did not stay confined to written television reviews either. It spread into video essay commentary as well, with the channel Wisecrack releasing a video built directly around the question, framed under the title, "Is South Park communist now?" examining the Amazon arc through that exact lens for an audience that consumes its criticism through video rather than print. The same basic question proved durable enough to resurface again years later, when Wisecrack returned to the subject in 2022, with a separate video titled, "Did South Park Turn Anti-Capitalist?" This time built around a different, more recent South Park special, showing that the question raised by Unfulfilled and Bike Parade back in 2018 had not simply faded away once that particular news cycle ended. It had become a recurring lens critics and commentators kept returning to anytime the show approached similar territory again. Despite how much attention this question generated across multiple outlets and multiple years, one piece has remained conspicuously absent from the entire conversation. Neither Trey Parker nor Matt Stone appears to have issued any public statement directly addressing whether their own political views or the show's underlying point of view had actually changed. Both men have spent their careers actively resisting exactly this kind of ideological labeling, and nothing in the record suggests they broke from that pattern here, choosing instead to let the episodes themselves generate the debate, while staying silent on what, if anything, those episodes were meant to prove about where they personally stand. The entire argument about whether South Park turned anti-capitalist has been carried almost entirely by critics, journalists, and commentators working from the text of the episodes themselves, rather than by any confirmation or denial coming directly from the 2 people who actually wrote them. Stepping back, the shape of this whole debate looks different from everything covered earlier in this video involving China. When South Park aimed its satire at a real communist government, the response came from that government itself, through a countrywide internet ban that could be documented, dated, and traced directly back to a single episode. When South Park aimed a very different kind of economic criticism at an American corporation and briefly let a fictional character speak in the language of Marx, the response came entirely from within American media and criticism, playing out as an argument over interpretation rather than as any kind of official reaction from a government or a company. Amazon itself does not appear to have issued any formal response to Unfulfilled or Bike Parade the way China's government responded to Banned in China. The fight over what these two episodes actually meant took place almost entirely inside newsrooms, review sections, and video essays, not in any statement from Jeff Bezos or from Amazon's own public relations department. Whatever the true answer to whether South Park's underlying politics genuinely shifted, or whether Unfulfilled and Bike Parade were simply one unusually sharp pair of episodes inside a much longer, messier run of material, the debate itself is real, well-documented, and treated seriously by outlets that do not normally spend this much energy dissecting the ideology behind a cartoon about fourth graders. That alone marks a real turning point in how seriously critics had started taking South Park's engagement with economic systems by this point in its history, regardless of which side of the debate any individual writer ultimately landed on. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. None of this debate, however it eventually gets resolved, involves the Soviet Union, Russia, or the Cold War directly. That particular thread of the show's history had gone quiet for years, waiting for a very different kind of episode, arriving after a real war had already begun to bring it back. Section 10, Back to the Cold War, Season 25, Episode 4, aired March 2nd, 2022. Cold War nostalgia meets real war. Mao Zedong spent his entire time on South Park standing silently in the background of somebody else's joke. More than 20 years later, a real war involving Russia gave the show a reason to bring Cold War imagery back to the front of the screen, this time built around an actual invasion happening in the real world while the episode was still being written. Russia invaded Ukraine on February 24th, 2022. Back to the Cold War aired just 6 days later on March 2nd, 2022, making it the 4th episode of Season 25 and the 315th episode of the series overall. According to reporting at the time, it holds the distinction of being the first scripted television episode anywhere to directly reference that invasion, a genuinely fast turnaround for any show, let alone one working with traditional animation rather than live-action footage. The episode opens inside Mr. Garrison's classroom, where he sits the 4th graders down to talk about difficult current events, seemingly setting up a conversation about the war. Instead, Garrison reveals he is actually talking about a recent fight with his boyfriend Rick, completely misreading what has the class on edge. Wendy Testaberger corrects him, explaining that the students are actually worried about Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia, and the war he has just started. Garrison, still fixated on his own relationship, misunderstands her entirely and responds as though she were making an unrelated joke about him rather than naming Russia's real president. Mackie barges into the middle of this conversation to run an emergency nuclear safety drill, sending the kids scrambling down the hallway to hide behind the gymnasium bleachers while he dances along to music styled after the 1980s. This is not an isolated incident. PC Principal later confronts Mackie after counting 7 separate drills across only 2 days, telling him plainly that the drills need to stop and suggesting that Mackie has become overly nostalgic for the Cold War era. Mackie brushes off the warning, at one point responding to PC Principal by speaking Russian and quoting a line directly from the 1989 film The Hunt for Red October, a movie he later admits to having watched more than 200 times. Once PC Principal leaves, Mackie sneaks into his office and secretly photographs his personal files, growing convinced that his own boss might secretly be working for Russia. Running alongside Mackie's spiraling paranoia is Butters Stotch's own storyline, centered on an upcoming dressage competition against the Russian student named Davy Solikov. Butters' parents, Stephen and Linda, treat the contest as something far bigger than a children's horse riding event, openly stating that they believe the Solikov family to be communists loyal to the Russian government. At one point, they use the real historical phrase "better dead than red," an actual slogan that circulated during the real Cold War as shorthand for rejecting communism outright rather than living under it, to underline exactly how seriously they are taking this dispute over children's horseback riding. They warn Butters that failure will have consequences far beyond losing a trophy, telling him his horse, Melancholy, will be sold off to communists, slaughtered, and turned into skin cream if he cannot win. Melancholy himself becomes one of the episode's biggest recurring jokes entirely on his own. During practice, the horse repeatedly stops mid-exercise to defecate, becomes visibly aroused at inconvenient moments, and eventually mounts and mates with another horse directly in the middle of a training session, embarrassing Butters in front of everyone watching. None of this cooperation problem seems to concern Butters' parents much, who remain far more interested in using their son's competition as a symbolic stand against Russia than in whether his horse can actually perform the sport correctly. Butters eventually goes to Mr. Mackey's office seeking counseling about the pressure his parents are putting on him. Mackey initially barely listens, still absorbed in his own growing conspiracy theories, until Butters happens to mention that his rival is Russian and that his family has framed the whole competition as a matter of national security. That detail immediately grabs Mackey's full attention, and he presses Butters for every detail he can share about the sport of dressage itself. Mackey later travels to the Solikov family stable to investigate for himself, only to discover Steven and Linda already there, actively trying to sabotage the family's horse ahead of the competition. Fully convinced by this point that PC Principal is a Russian spy, and that the entire dressage tournament is secretly cover for a coordinated plan to launch nuclear missiles, Mackey heads to his childhood family home, where he digs up an old floppy disk and a dial-up modem to break into the real-world defense network known as NORAD, in a sequence built directly around the plot of the 1983 film War Games. Using BASIC, a simple programming language commonly found on home computers from the 1980s, like the Commodore 64, Mackey manages to hack into the system and simulate what looks like an actual incoming Russian nuclear attack, triggering a real escalation of the country's defense readiness level. Russian officials detect the change and immediately alert Putin, who the episode reveals has been feeling nostalgic himself in recent days, mirroring exactly what is happening to Mackey on the American side. Just as Mackey prepares to escalate the alert level even further, his own mother interrupts him. What follows is the emotional center of the entire episode. Mackey's mother calmly tells him that his sudden obsession with returning to the Cold War era has nothing to do with Russia at all, and everything to do with his own fear of growing older. She reminds him that the actual Cold War involved real fear and real death, not the simple, comforting division between a clear good guy and a clear bad guy that he remembers it as now. And she points out that even his own body was already struggling back then, suggesting that men his age at the time coped with that same fear by retreating into imaginary war games rather than facing it directly. Mackey reacts with visible shame at hearing this, but his mother reassures him that the nostalgia only ever felt good because it was familiar, not because that period of history was actually good to live through. The episode's climax turns the children's dressage competition into a direct parody of the ending of the real 1985 film Rocky IV, in which the American boxer Rocky Balboa defeats a Soviet opponent named Ivan Drago inside Russia itself. Just as Davy Solikov is about to win the dressage event outright, Melancholy suddenly mounts Solikov's own horse in the middle of the course, throwing Davy to the ground. Rather than a dressage official, a boxing referee appears to count Davy out, officially declaring Butters the winner, in a scene deliberately built to mirror the boxing ring finish from the real film. Mr. Mackey then arrives, draped in an American flag, to deliver a triumphant speech to the assembled crowd, telling the Russians watching that if a person like him can change, then Russia can change too, echoing Rocky's real closing speech to the Soviet crowd at the end of the actual movie, almost beat for beat. In one final image referencing the same source film, Putin is shown reacting from Russia with a quiet, resigned side glance toward his own men, closely mirroring how the movie originally depicted Soviet leadership reacting to Drago's defeat. Putin's presence throughout the episode carries its own thread of comic commentary running underneath the main plot. At one point, he is shown dancing shirtless to the real 1984 song Two Tribes by the British band Frankie Goes to Hollywood. And by the episode's end, when Mackey delivers a closing television address to Russia suggesting that men become more aggressive as they age, specifically because of declining physical performance, a shirtless Putin is shown quietly, solemnly agreeing with that exact assessment from thousands of miles away. None of this played out in a vacuum separate from real events happening at the same time. A review from the AV Club, published the day after the episode aired, pointed out that plenty of real journalists, academics, and even world leaders had already begun publicly suggesting that Putin's decision to invade Ukraine was driven at least partly by his own fear of aging and mortality. The same review specifically cited a Yale historian who had described Putin on CNN around the same time as an aging man confronting his own death who had chosen to destroy the world rather than accept it. Whether or not that theory actually explains anything real about Putin's motivations, the review noted it was already circulating widely in serious political commentary before South Park ever built an entire episode around the exact exact same idea, showing that even this episode's most absurd-seeming premise was responding to a real conversation already happening in the news. The episode also connects back to South Park's own earlier storytelling in a small but pointed way. Back in the finale of Season 20, a recurring group of characters called the Member Berries, small nostalgic creatures who spend their scenes trying to lure people back toward memories of the past, were shown specifically trying to influence Vladimir Putin by getting him to remember the Cold War. Back to the Cold War effectively treats this new episode as the long-delayed payoff of that much earlier joke, suggesting within the show's own fictional universe that those seeds planted years before had finally taken root. Critics responded to the episode with a generally positive but measured reception. The AV Club's review gave it a grade of B+, specifically praising the conversation between Mackie and his mother as a strong piece of classic South Park insight into how nostalgia distorts memory, drawing a direct line between this episode and two earlier ones built around similar themes, the Memberberry storyline and a widely praised episode called You're Getting Old, which had explored aging in a very different but thematically related way. On IMDb, the episode holds a more modest audience score of roughly 6.6 out of 10, reflecting a more mixed reaction among general viewers than among professional critics. One small real-world detail sits underneath Butter's entire dressage storyline as well. According to production notes about the episode, Butter's role in this particular story was directly inspired by Trey Parker's own daughter, Betty Boogie Parker, who is a genuine, award-winning dressage rider in real life, meaning the sport at the center of this entire subplot was not chosen at random, but pulled from something happening in the show's own creator's family at the time. Mao Zedong never spoke a word across every appearance covered at the start of this video. Xi Jinping picked up a phone and eventually lost an entire country's internet over a bear. An American warehouse worker quoted Marx from inside a cardboard box before dying at the hands of a fictional Jeff Bezos. And in this final episode, an actual living president gets compared quite directly to an aging man too afraid of his own mortality to stop starting fights, delivered through a school counselor hacking Cold War-era software and a horse that would rather mate mid-competition than finish its own routine. That range, stretching from a silent background gag in a Christmas special all the way to a joke built around a war that had started less than a week earlier, is the clearest evidence of how far South Park's relationship with communism actually travels once every documented piece of it gets laid out end to end. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.